everybody. Ciao. We're here with two very eminent figures in the literary world. First of all, we have our Bologna Book Plus author ambassador, MICHÈLE Roberts, and who is a prolific author and also a literary critic. So welcome, MICHÈLE. And I'm slightly overawed by the gentleman to my right, Leonard S. Marcus, who is also a prolific author from the United States and is a very acclaimed literary critic and in the sphere of children's books. So what we have today is, to my right, children's books expertise, and to my left, the general publishing adult market expertise. And Leonard's publications include Horn and also the New York Literary Supplement, or New York Times. Is that correct? Yes. So what we're going to do is have a little exploration around the role of the literary critic. And actually, I'm going to invite Leonard to start off with to explain what the process is of being a literary critic to start off with.
Okay. Well, I mean, when I've reviewed many, many books, and the first thing that I always do is to read the book and read it again and again until I've internalized it to some extent. And my goal is to really understand what it was that the writer, and if there's an illustrator, the artist, hoped to accomplish. And then I watch my reaction. I mean, I usually have a subjective reaction, and then when I write the review, what I'm really doing is explaining to myself why I felt that way. When people are not really doing their job as reviewers, they sometimes review the book they wish they had rather than the book that they do have in front of them. So my goal is to first figure out what that book really is, what the author wanted to accomplish, and how well he or she managed to do it. The other really big part of reviewing for me is making clear why I think what I say I think about the book, rather than just making a blanket declaration about it. Because I think it's the reviewer's obligation to give the reader an opportunity to disagree with you. And you can only do that if you can grasp the thinking that went behind the opinion that is being expressed in the review. Otherwise, it's just bullying, basically. And that I really detest.
So the substantiation of the opinion is absolutely vital.
Yeah.
Yeah. And MICHÈLE, would you agree with that? We're going to talk about your role as a critic before going on to the role of the author.
Yes, I would. I review both for the printed media and also for radio. In the past, I reviewed on TV. I suppose there was a slight lure on TV of trying to be a little bit funnier or a little bit more charming simply because you were on TV. But I think it's very important, and I completely agree with Leonard, that you're there to let the author kind of imprint you and then to judge how well that process has happened. I would just quickly add that I think one way of reviewing children's books is to take an armful of them and read them with children, and then they become the reviewers, and you very quickly find out what children's books are working for their intended audience. Because sometimes I think, when I'm an adult, I've got to liberate my inner child, definitely. You know, I like rude rhymes, I like things that are funny, I like things that are a bit edgy, and I always have done since childhood. But in a way, my adult self's got to try and stand aside and just think about the children who'll be reading. And it is, of course, different reviewing books for adults.
So I'd like you to respond on that.
Sure.
Leonard. Yeah.
Well, I think, you know, the people who do well in the children's book world, either as authors or illustrators or reviewers or anything else, I think have a very direct line to their own childhood memories on an emotional level. And I mean, I can tell you what I did on the first day of kindergarten when I was 4.5 years old. I can picture it completely. And not everybody can do that, but I certainly agree that it's important to just separate, to the extent that it's humanly possible, one's adult self from the reality of children who might be coming to the book, whether it's your own reality or not. And I can say that as a parent, my ideas about reviewing were expanded and sort of held up to question, because my son was attracted to certain books when he was young that I never would have thought to give a good review to. And what I learned from that was that children respond to books for all sorts of reasons. And some of them have nothing to do with art or literature, though those are certainly valid concerns and for a reviewer to highlight. But children often just gravitate toward the book that means something important to them at a given moment. Like they want a dog, and here's a book about a dog, and it doesn't almost matter how good the book is from a critical standpoint. So I've learned to think of reviewing as, take it with a grain of salt, I guess you could say.
So in terms of writing the review, and you're both authors, you know, crafting the review, is it essay writing? Is it short story writing? You know, what? Let's go to Michèle first of all.
I think it's a conversation. If anyone's bothering to read book reviews, and that could be quite a small audience maybe, you simply want to hook them. It's like going to a party and checking people out, going up to a group, being brave, saying, hey, what a great coat that person over there is wearing. You want to engage them. And you want to be thoughtful and perhaps funny, but it's about initiating a conversation, never lecturing or showing off. Perhaps we all have a secret show-off inside us, but that has to be kept down.
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely. Something I've noticed about reviewing is the way you address the audience is partly dependent on what kind of publication you're writing for. For example, with the New York Times, for which I've done a lot of freelance reviewing, you can assume, and the Times assumes, that the reader knows a lot about the world. So you can make references to classic books, for example, that in some way relate to the book you're writing about, to sort of illuminate, to put the book in a context. Whereas for 21 years I was the book reviewer for Parenting magazine, which went to the parents of very young children, mostly mothers. And there was no reason to assume that that very large readership was, at all attuned to the history of children's literature. So I had to write in a different way. I had to make different assumptions about the background of my readers. But having said that, it was always about trying to be clear, trying to be friendly, engaging in some way. To me, writing is writing, and most writing is storytelling. So a review can be a kind of story about another story.
So know your audience is the real takeout from there.
Yes.
Yeah. So you're writing for that audience, as one always does. Yeah.
Although I think I'd have to add that assumptions I could have made as a younger writer about an audience having a certain knowledge of, say, French. Nowadays, I just couldn't make that assumption. So when I'm writing for something as intellectual as the Times Literary Supplement, and I'm reviewing a French novel that's been translated, if I want to quote the original French, I'm going to need to make a little translation and put it in brackets, because I think audiences are no longer a kind of totality. There are different audiences who might all be reading the TLS, and I've got to try and think about all of them and get that right.
I would hope that means to say that the audience is wider and more mass market rather than less educated.
I guess.
I'm being kind. What do you think, Leonard?
I'm sorry.
Well, sort of not making assumptions about knowledge. Perhaps reviewing has changed over the last 20 years.
Oh, I see. Yeah, no, I mean, I never thought reviewing should be treated as a sort of an intellectual exercise, where you're putting your knowledge kind of in the foreground, maybe in opposition to the reader. And I think you're always trying to find a common ground with the reader. And it may well be that at whatever level, the readers today have less background than in the past, yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because, I think that takes us on to what the responsibility of the reviewer is. And I'm going to come to you first, Leonard, because I imagine that the responsibility of the reviewer in the children's book market is perhaps different from responsibility in a more general adult market.
Yeah. Well, there's always a leap of imagination, I think, in writing about children's books because, I mean, children are developmentally different in some ways from adults, and it's important to try to understand what those differences are and to try to think about not only whether the book is, quote, good or not, but who it's really for. I think some of the great children's books work on many levels, and so, for example, a book which everyone reads to their children at night in the US and perhaps elsewhere, Goodnight Moon, I mean, to a very young child, like a 1-year-old, it can be experienced just as rhythm and musicality, and it's a lullaby. To a 3 or so 4-year-old, it can be the beginning of learning to recognize words on the page. So the book is beautifully crafted in such a way that it can have more than one audience. And so I think one of the things that the reviewer of a children's book wants to do is to talk about that. There's a tendency to think of children's books as being very segmented, but I like the thought, and I think, because I think it's true, that, that there's more of a fluidity in terms of the audience for many children's books than is generally acknowledged. So that would be one issue, and you know, parents are often well-meaning and they want to provide their children with the best books, but they have no idea what that means, except maybe for a few that they remember from their own childhood. So I think it's also important for the reviewer of children's books to give parents and other adults a kind of framework for not only understanding children's books, but also feeling comfortable with them and knowing, for example, that they can't make a mistake when they're, and destroy their child's life by reading the book in a less than optimal way, which is a fear that a lot of very educated parents have. They're afraid of doing it the wrong way. So, I mean, those are just examples of what a reviewer of children's books, I think, is obligated to help provide for the reader.
Oh, interesting. And do you have to keep up with changes in education then around that in terms of reviewing children's books and what you select, I guess?
Well, I mean, I have taught for over 10 years a course on children's books and child development. So I'm pretty immersed in the psychological literature of child development, and there are different ideas about that. So it's not as if there's one yes and one no to any of it. But I've never used psychological jargon in writing about books, because I think that would put the reader off right from the start. But I think it's important to understand what the sort of themes of different stages of development are in the child's life, like the need for a home at the very beginning of life, like an emotional center, or the issues surrounding going out from home to school and coming to terms with the world of your peers. And those, I think, are valid and important aspects of a child's really universal experience that can and should be related to any story book that a child is potentially going to be presented with.
Thank you. And what about the responsibility in your sphere of literary critique, Michèle?
I think it's really important not to be cruel. I think it's important not to review a book that you think is really bad, really trashy, that you're offended by, and you just want to slam it. I think that review would just take up precious space that could be much better used for promoting a book you really love and want to tell people about. That's one of my personal rules. So I don't review things that I think are really terrible. And, there is quite a lot of trash around. And, okay, the trash pile. I've been on the receiving end of cruel reviews, so I think that taught me a lot as a critic myself, that an enormous amount of work goes into making a book, doesn't it? And some of it's invisible. Teams of people. I want to salute that. I want to stick up for work that I think is beautiful and important and give the arguments as to why. So my don't be cruel rule sees me through.
So if you haven't got something nice to say it, don't say it. But Leonard, you're also an author.
Yeah,
so
no, I'm so glad you thought of that, to say that, Michèle. The only exception, I mean, I would never be cruel, but the only exception I would make to getting deeper into the negative aspects of a book would be in the case of, for example, well, with Parenting Magazine, that magazine existed as to provide services to its readers. Like, you know, I don't know anything about children's books. Tell me about 6 books this month that you would recommend. So there's no point in choosing books that I don't think highly of in that circumstance. But in the New York Times, which calls itself the newspaper of record, and which has a much broader audience, and I think the responsibility shifts. And I would never choose a first-time author's book to take apart. But let's say a rock star or a famous actor wrote a picture book, as many have, and it was clearly a cynical career move on the part of that author and the publisher because the person is so famous. That, I think, is worth noting, because those are the books that people are going to buy because they're familiar and because they have almost no idea what else to buy. And so I think those need to be flagged, and I think it's a responsibility of the reviewer to do that, but only in that circumstance.
Interesting. And then in terms of the past 5 years, we've probably seen a huge amount of cultural and societal change. And so reviewing through the prism of that, is that something that, I'll go to Leonard first again on the children's, if I may. That brings its own responsibilities and challenges and possible opportunities.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been interested in small press publishing in America since the 1970s, which is a long time ago, and also in what came to be called multicultural publishing, books by and about and for children from minority cultures. That has become a very front and center issue in America in the last few years. So I think that's a great thing. And the publishers have responded, and now we're starting to see the field open up a great deal more than it ever was before. I've written about the history of this, going back 100 years, and every 10 or 15 years there would be an attempt to diversify children's books in America from a racial and ethnic point of view, and there would never be enough of a market for those books to achieve a foothold in the marketplace in general. But that really is beginning to change now. So, you know, I'm happy to contribute to that whenever I can.
Thank you. And Michèle, do you want to talk to the societal and cultural changes?
Yes, I think we're really seeing them. And I think, for example, because I talk to a lot of readers as I cruise around enjoying my life and working, and a lot of the people I know who've come from African families 2 or 3 generations ago, or Caribbean families, just to take those 2 as examples, for a long time people were saying, you know, we want to read wonderful books to our children, but we never see ourselves reflected in those books, either as characters in the prose, in the story, or in the pictures. And of course, you know, you look at this fantastic exhibition and you just think, hang on a minute, there's an awful lot of white people still in these books, on these book jackets. And I think it's a struggle that has been led in Britain by black writers, black readers, black parents, to change things. And we are beginning to see those results. Another change I'd note is about sexuality, I think. You can now find in the UK books about being gay, or not making a big thing about being gay, but there's a gay heroine, gay hero, a gay person in between. I remember picking up some books in a bookshop for my great nieces and nephews, not reading the story, but just being transformed and transfigured and transported by the wonderful artwork about this child called Julian, who puts on party frocks and swishes off to parties with his 2 large black godmothers. And I didn't realize this was a book designed for parents and children who might be curious about trans. I just thought, what a delicious, beautiful book. I bought several copies immediately, and they went down a storm with my very straight religious family, which was very, very nice.
The other thing to say, at least about the U.S., is there is a strong commitment now, I think, on the part both of publishers and librarians toward greatly expanding the diversity of children's books, defining diversity in many different ways. But at the same time, it's one of the worst times for censorship of books in the United States. And the main targets are books that have to do with race and sexuality and gender identity. So those books are being supported by the people who create them and distribute them through libraries, but they're also under an attack which is not only widespread but systematic. It's the latter part which makes it particularly bad and rare.
So freedom of expression and how critics can help with that is presumably vital.
I would say so, and also the awards, which are a kind of criticism, really. When you confer an award, you're saying that's a good one. The awards become evidence when there are hearings to defend a book, and the experts all agree that this is an excellent book. So how can you say it doesn't belong in the library?
And we're surrounded here by the most beautiful illustrations. I just, before we close, because I know that we're on a very tight time schedule, I just wanted to think about the role of the jacket, possibly in YA books, Leonard, actually, rather than, and how they draw you in, and just the importance and the first impressions. This is Michèle's jacket of her latest book, so I'll show that. But Michèle, how does a jacket influence you?
I think the jacket's more important very often with books I don't know about. So I'll go into a bookshop to browse, and it's the artwork on the jacket that jumps at me, certain particular colours. I mean, these are just amazing artworks. It's a really beautiful exhibition, even though not terribly diverse. But it's always the image, it's the artwork that gets me first.
Well, so, we have an old saying, you can't judge a book by its cover, but I think that if you can't judge a book by its cover, there's something wrong with the cover. Because it's like a logo. I mean, it should be a distillation of what's inside, and it should be a signal to the reader that here's why you might find this of interest.
And have you had big tussles, big arguments with your publishers over the years, over the right jacket in your mind?
Oh, once in a while, yeah. But I just want to sort of related to all this. I mean, I think jackets are very important for picture books as well, because again, you're dealing often with parents who don't really know what they're looking for. So the cover has to be some sort of a reassuring and clarifying message as to what the book might offer. And interestingly, if you look at the cover for Where the Wild Things Are, just to name a very, very well-known book, it's one of the few book jackets you'll ever find that doesn't have the hero of the story on the cover. And today that would never be acceptable by a publishing company. Publishing has really shifted and become more market-driven. That was meant to set you in a dreamy mood, and these days there's a little less time for that.
So just before we leave, I just would like to know whether or not either of you have reviewed your own literary criticism from maybe 20 years ago and thought, I perhaps wouldn't write that now. I may have got that wrong, or...
You're asking us to have brilliant memories. I'm going to pass. My memory, it's like yesterday, and my God, yesterday was fabulous. Tomorrow might be great.
Leonard.
Well, I mean, I would go back to what I said before about learning from my son, that there are all kinds of reasons for loving children's books, and I came to realize that my, so-called standards are not as hard and fast as I originally thought they were.
Well, thank you very much indeed. If any of you have got any questions for either Leonard or Michèle, I'm sure they'll be around just afterwards. Sure. But thank you very much. Thank you for coming and thank you for speaking.